let's get into it, shall we? I hope you're all ready. We're going to first just start by going over the summaries of each chapter. This will be hopefully helpful, especially for those of you who haven't read up to this point. But even for those of you who have, including myself, I like to just revisit these from time to time when I jump back into the book and start a chapter. This will also help to contextualize chapter 4, which is, of course, the final chapter of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And it is a thick chapter. So again, there's going to be sections where I am reading without analyzing for stretches at a time, because if I were to try to analyze every paragraph, we'll be here all day, and I can't do that. If you are interested, Cheryl, in checking out the first 3 chapters and our readings of it, you can check out the channel Reading with Elliot. I'll pull that up for you really quickly. Reading with Elliot is one of my side channels, and on it I post the live streams as well as personal recordings at home of essentially audiobooks. So we've posted all the different Pedagogy of the Oppressed streams. We also did I did a audiobook sort of reading of this essay on Cop City, and one about public space, this David Harvey essay. So it's got about 1,000 subscribers. I do this for free. I don't have any ads on this channel. I just would like to allow you guys to have free audiobook content for reading on the go, for those of you who are potentially disabled, just for those of you who enjoy reading with somebody else. I've started recording, actually, so if you're watching this right now on YouTube, hi. What's up, Moni, Cheryl, Name, Stephanie? I'm really glad to see you as well, Stephanie Fang. With that being said, I'll get back into, I think the screen has glitched out a little bit there. Hopefully that's not a recurring problem. Let's get into these chapter summaries. So chapter 1 was about the justification for a pedagogy of the oppressed, the contradiction between the oppressors and the oppressed, and how it is overcome, oppression and the oppressors, oppression and the oppressed, liberation, not a gift, not a self-achievement, but a mutual process. Chapter 2 was on the banking education, the banking concept of education as an instrument of oppression, its presuppositions. Let me move my mic over. A critique, the problem-posing concept of education as an instrument for liberation, its presuppositions, the banking concept and the teacher-student contradiction, the problem-posing concept and the supersedence of the teacher-student contradiction, education, a mutual process, world-mediated, people as uncompleted beings, conscious of their incompletion, and their attempt to be more fully human. Chapter 3 was about dialogics, the essence of education as the practice of freedom, dialogics and dialogue and the search for program content, the human-world relationship, generative themes, and the program content of education as the practice of freedom, the investigation of generative themes and its methodology, the awakening of critical consciousness through the investigation of generative themes, the various stages of the investigation. That's chapter 3. Finally, chapter 4, what we're about to read. Note that this starts on page 125. It ends on page 183. So this is going to be almost 60 pages that we're about to read. Strap in. Anti-dialogics and dialogics as matrices of opposing theories of cultural action. I know for those of you who are new here, this is like word salad. This is like getting hit in the head with large words. But it'll be okay. I promise. Sometimes you don't have to understand everything being said. There are many things in this book that I'm like, I don't think I understand this. I kind of understand it, but I kind of don't. I'm not sure why this word is used or this wording is being used. And that is because I'm interested in the text, because I find it so valuable. It just prompts me to want to dig in more. And I think that that's the way to approach these kinds of things. We don't want to too often we dismiss our own abilities to like keep trying to read things, if we have the time, if we have the will, we should give it a shot. Give it a shot. Try your best to understand a text, even when it's super dense, because you'll find it very enriching sometimes. So anti-dialogics and dialogics is matrices of opposing theories of cultural action. The former as an instrument of oppression and the latter as an instrument of liberation. The theory of anti-dialogical action and its characteristics: conquest, divide and rule, manipulation, and cultural invasion. The theory of dialogical action and its characteristics: cooperation, unity, organization, and cultural synthesis. So yeah, chapters 3 and 4 dig into dialogics quite a lot. Chapter 4 gets into some more sort of particular versions of anti-dialogics and dialogics. And you might be wondering, what could be sent? What is it that you mean by dialogics, Paulo Freire? What does he mean by dialogics? And to me, sorry for the large breath that I just did right into the freaking microphone. To me, what is meant by dialogics is something concerning dialogue, particularly the sort of essence of and the process of having authentic dialogue, right? The logics of dialogue, in a sense, right? So if something is dialogical, that means it is facilitative of, constitutive of, comprised of, full of dialogue. And for something to be anti-dialogic, you can see how that would be an instrument of oppression, right? Something oppressors do, because it tries to shut down dialogue, in a sense, right? It's against dialogue. It's against dialogics. It's against the work of, creating dialogue in that sense as well. Dialogic is similar to dialectic in some ways. Real dialogue is dialectical. So that's sort of what the thing would be, in a sense. Where dialectics are more so about bringing contradictions together and understanding something stronger through pairing it with contradictions, through recognizing the contradictions, the synthesis, the antithesis, the thesis, right? Two different contradictory things, and then you figure out what the thing is from there. That's essentially dialectics in a lot of ways. And it's emotion, right? So dialogics are dialectical, but they're mostly, they're understanding a dialectical approach. A dialectical approach is necessary because it's about dialogue, and dialogue has to be dialectical. Real dialogue with a person has to be about gaining new truths with them, understanding deeper things with them. Both people learning and educating the other simultaneously, being with the other person when you converse with somebody versus talking at them, talking for them, memorizing things, telling them to grasp certain things. That's my understanding. Let's start chapter 4. That's kind of like it, Stephanie. But dialectics is more in the philosophical sense. So we can understand anything through a dialectical understanding of it, which means, we're continuously learning more and more about it by looking at the things about it that we don't understand, that contradict each other, and then understanding how those contradictions are actually necessary. They're actually, you're supposed to, instead of stuffing them, instead of avoiding them, you're supposed to use them to understand that thing in a deeper way. That's a lot of what I kind of take dialectics as. Now, a lot of people might end up yelling at me in the comment section on the Reading with Elliot channel afterwards and say, that's not a good description of dialectics, and it's probably not. But I think in this context, that's a helpful way to kind of understand dialectics. Yeah, Socrates was sort of the original dialectician, especially in like the Greek sense, versus the sort of different versions of dialectics that we get over time. All right, chapter 4, folks. Here we go. Again, I breathed into the microphone. I apologize. Let me bring it farther away from you. This chapter which analyzes the theories of cultural action which develop from anti-dialogical and dialogical matrices. One sec. Here we go. Will make frequent reference to points presented in the previous chapters, either to expand these points or to clarify new affirmations. I shall start by reaffirming that humankind, as beings of the praxis, differ from animals, which are beings of pure activity. Animals do not consider the world, they are immersed in it. In contrast, human beings emerge from the world, objectify it, and in so doing can understand it and transform it with their labor. This is Freire doing the animal versus human thing again. We kind of talk about this a bit more, I think, in chapter 3. And like, what does he mean by it? Why is it necessary? Does it hold up? Is it a bit too Promethean? Is it a bit too anti-animal? But you see what the sort of point of what he's saying is, right? Because we're talking about this idea of humanization, so we have to understand what does it mean to be human. And this is sort of Freire's working here. Animals which do not labor live in a setting which they cannot transcend. Hence, each animal species lives in the context appropriate to it, and these contexts, while open to humans, cannot communicate among themselves. So the context appropriate to it is not saying all animals get what they deserve, but that all animals don't really conceptualize deserve versus not deserve. They're not concerned with deeper philosophical questions. They're just fully submerged in their realities. And Freire calls for humans to not do that. We have long had, from the beginning of time, the gumption, the ability, the capacity, the desire to consider our environments, to philosophize, to think deeply about how to transform the environment, how to transform situations. Animals are at least less capable of transforming situations for themselves, let's say. If a dog ends up in a really bad sort of house that's not treating it well, it doesn't really have recourse to transform that situation other than escaping it. Thanks, Jasmine. But human activity consists of action and reflection. It is praxis. It is transformation of the world. And as praxis, it requires theory to illuminate it. Human activity is theory and practice. It is reflection and action. It cannot, as I stressed in chapter 2, be reduced to either verbalism or activism. Lenin's famous statement, "Without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement," means that a revolution is achieved with neither verbalism nor activism, but rather with praxis, that is, with reflection and action, directed at the structures to be transformed. Note 1, Vladimir Lenin, What is to be done? Page 69. The revolutionary efforts to transform these structures radically cannot designate its leaders as its thinkers and the oppressed as mere doers. If true commitment to the people, involving the transformation of the reality by which they are oppressed, requires a theory of transforming action, this theory cannot fail to assign the people a fundamental role in the transformation process. The leaders cannot treat the oppressed as mere activists to be denied the opportunity of reflection and allowed merely the illusion of acting, whereas in fact they would continue to be manipulated, and in this case by the presumed foes of manipulation. The leaders do bear the responsibility for coordination and at times direction, but leaders who deny praxis to the oppressed thereby invalidate their own praxis. By imposing their word on others, they falsify that word and establish a contradiction between their methods and their objectives. if they are truly committed to liberation. Their action and reflection cannot proceed without the action and reflection of others. Revolutionary praxis must stand opposed to the praxis of the dominant elites, for they are by nature antithetical. Revolutionary praxis cannot tolerate an absurd dichotomy, in which the praxis of the people is merely that of, It seems my internet went out there. I don't know if you heard the boom sound, but it seemed as if OBS Studio went out for a second there. For those of you who are still here, just let me know if you see me and if you hear me okay. My recording will be okay, so for those of you on YouTube, stay out of it. Don't worry about it. Here I am waving, just letting you know I'm here. Sorry about the inconvenience. Apparently it's my internet. I'm connected to a LAN cable, but unfortunate. Oh well. Well, hopefully that doesn't happen again. As I was saying, revolutionary praxis must stand opposed to the praxis of the dominant elites, for they are by nature antithetical. Revolutionary praxis cannot tolerate an absurd dichotomy, in which the praxis of the people is merely that of following the leaders' decisions, a dichotomy reflecting the prescriptive methods of the dominant elites. Revolutionary praxis is a unity, and the leaders cannot treat the oppressed as their possession. Manipulation, sloganizing, depositing, regimentation, and prescription cannot be components of revolutionary praxis, precisely because they are components of the praxis of domination. In order to dominate, the dominator has no choice but to deny true praxis to the people, deny them the right to say their own word and think their own thoughts. He and she cannot act dialogically, for to do so would mean either that they had relinquished their power to dominate and joined the cause of the oppressed, or had lost that power through miscalculation. Conversely, revolutionary leaders who do not act dialogically in their relations with the people either have retained characteristics of the dominator and are not truly revolutionary, or they are totally misguided in their conception of their role, and, prisoners of their own sectarianism, are equally non-revolutionary. They may even reach power. But the validity of any revolution resulting from anti-dialogical action is thoroughly doubtful. It is absolutely essential that the oppressed participate in the revolutionary process with an increasingly critical awareness of their role as subjects of the transformation. If they are drawn into the process as ambiguous beings, partly themselves and partly the oppressors housed within them, and if they come to power still embodying that ambiguity imposed on them by the situation of oppression, it is my contention that they will merely imagine they have reached power. Their existential duality may even facilitate the rise of a sectarian climate, leading to the installation of bureaucracies which undermine the revolution. Note 2. This danger further requires the revolutionary leaders to resist imitating the procedures of the oppressors, who enter, quote-unquote, the oppressed and are, quote-unquote, housed by the latter. The revolutionaries, in their praxis with the oppressed, cannot try to reside in the latter. On the contrary, when they try, with the oppressed, to throw out the oppressors, they do this in order to live with the oppressed, not to live within them. If the oppressed do not become aware of this ambiguity during the course of the revolutionary process, they may participate in that process with a spirit more revanchist than revolutionary. Excuse me. Note 3. Although the oppressed, who have always been subject to a regime of exploitation, may understandably impart a revanchist dimension to the revolutionary struggle, the revolution must not exhaust its forces in this dimension. Sorry for the stumbling. Revanchist, essentially, to my understanding, is revengeist, right? It's about revenge. It's about sort of a almost thirst to get revenge on the people who did you wrong. And what Freire's saying is that that's part of revolutions, especially like ones that are violent, which is most, if not all. There is some dimension of we're going to get this motherfucker back, but that dimension cannot dominate. It cannot be the point, and any elements of it and energy that exists within the revolution, within revolutionary action, should be, if not minimized, it should be carefully used. And the revolution can't exhaust its forces, he says. You shouldn't put too much into that. They may aspire to revolution as a means of domination, rather than as a road to liberation. And that's why. A lot of times revenge just turns into, I want to be the bad person that you were, right? I want to dominate you. I want to dominate other people the way that I was dominated, which is not what we're trying to do. If revolutionary leaders who incarnate a genuine humanism have difficulties and problems, the difficulties and problems will be far greater for a group of leaders who try, even with the best of intentions, to carry out the revolution for the people. To attempt this is equivalent to carrying out a revolution without the people, because the people are drawn into the process by the same methods and procedures used to oppress them. Dialogue with the people is radically necessary to every authentic revolution. This is what makes it a revolution, as distinguished from a military coup. One does not expect dialogue from a coup, only deceit, in order to achieve legitimacy, or force, in order to repress. Sooner or later, a true revolution must initiate a courageous dialogue with the people. Its very legitimacy lies in that dialogue. Note 4. While we might obtain some benefit from doubt, said Fidel Castro to the Cuban people as he confirmed the death of Guevara, lies, fear of the truth, complicity with false illusions, and complicity with lies have never been weapons of the revolution. Quoted in Gramma, October 17, 1967, emphasis added. It cannot fear the people, their expression, their effective participation in power. It must be accountable to them, must speak frankly to them of its achievements, its mistakes, its miscalculations, and its difficulties. The earlier dialogue begins, the more truly revolutionary will the movement be. The dialogue, which is radically necessary to revolution, corresponds to another radical need, that of women and men as beings who cannot truly be human apart from communication, for they are essentially communicative creatures. To impede communication is to reduce men to the status of things, and this is a job for oppressors, not for revolutionaries. Let me emphasize that my defense of the praxis implies no dichotomy by which this praxis could be divided into a prior stage of reflection and a subsequent stage of action. Action and reflection occur simultaneously. A critical analysis of reality may, however, reveal that a particular form of action is impossible or inappropriate at the present time. Those who, through reflection, perceive the infeasibility or inappropriateness of one or another form of action, which should accordingly be postponed or substituted, cannot thereby be accused of inaction. Critical reflection is also action. I previously stated that in education, the attempt of the teacher's students to understand a cognizable object is not exhausted in that object, because this act extends to other students' teachers in such a way that the cognizable object mediates their capacity for understanding. The same is true of revolutionary action. That is, the oppressed and the leaders are equally the subjects of revolutionary action, and reality serves as the medium for the transforming action of both groups. In this theory of action, one cannot speak of an actor, nor simply of actors, but rather of actors in intercommunication. This affirmation might appear to imply division, dichotomy, rupture of the revolutionary forces. In fact, it signifies exactly the opposite, their communion. Apart from this communion, we do see dichotomy, leaders on one side and people on the other, in a replica of the relations of oppression. Denial of communion in the revolutionary process, avoidance of dialogue with the people under the pretext of organizing them, of strengthening revolutionary power, or of ensuring a united front, is really a fear of freedom. It is fear of or lack of faith in the people. But if the people cannot be trusted, there is no reason for liberation. In this case, the revolution is not even carried out for the people, but by the people for the leaders, a complete self-negation. The revolution is made neither by the leaders for the people, nor by the people for the leaders, but by both acting together in unshakable solidarity. This solidarity is born only when the leaders witness to it by their humble, loving, and courageous encounter with the people. Not all men and women have sufficient courage for this encounter. But when they avoid encounter, they become inflexible and treat others as mere objects. Instead of nurturing life, they kill life. Instead of searching for life, they flee from it. And these are oppressor characteristics. Some may think that to affirm dialogue, the encounter of women and men in the world in order to transform the world, is naively and subjectively idealistic. Note 5. Once more, let me repeat that this dialogical encounter cannot take place between antagonists. There is nothing, however, more real or concrete than people in the world and with the world, than humans with other humans, and some people against others as oppressing and oppressed classes. Authentic revolution attempts to transform the reality which begets this dehumanizing state of affairs. Those whose interests are served by that reality cannot carry out this transformation. It must be achieved by the tyrannized with their leaders. The truth, however, must become radically consequential. That is, the leaders must incarnate it through communion with the people. In this communion, both groups grow together, and the leaders, instead of being simply self-appointed, are installed or authenticated in their praxis with the praxis of the people. Many persons, bound to a mechanistic view of reality, do not perceive that the concrete situation of individuals conditions their consciousness of the world, and that in turn this consciousness conditions their attitudes and their ways of dealing with reality. They think that reality can be transformed mechanistically without posing the person's false consciousness of reality as a problem, or through revolutionary action, developing a consciousness which is less and less false. Note 6. The epochs during which the dominant classes are stable, epochs in which the workers' movement must defend itself against a very powerful adversary, which is occasionally threatening and is in every case solidly seated in power, produces naturally a socialist literature which emphasizes the material element of reality, the obstacles to be overcome, and the scant efficacy of human awareness and action. There is no historical reality which is not human. There is no history without humankind, and no history for human beings. There is only history of humanity, made by people and, as Marx pointed out, in turn making them. It is when the majorities are denied their right to participate in history as subjects that they become dominated and alienated. Thus, to supersede their condition as objects by the status of subjects, the objective of any true revolution, requires that the people act as well as reflect upon the reality to be transformed. It would indeed be idealistic to affirm that by merely reflecting on oppressive reality and discovering their status as objects, persons have thereby already become subjects. But while this perception in and of itself does not mean that thinkers have become subjects, it does mean, as one of my co-investigators affirmed, that they are subjects in expectancy. An expectancy which leads them to seek to solidify their new status. Note 7, Fernando Garcia, a Honduran, in a course for Latin Americans. On the other hand, it would be a false premise to believe that activism, which is not true action, is the road to revolution. People will be truly critical if they live the plenitude of the praxis, that is, if their action encompasses a critical reflection which increasingly organizes their thinking and thus leads them to move from a purely naive knowledge of reality to a higher level, one which enables them to perceive the causes of reality. If revolutionary leaders deny this right to the people, they impair their own capacity to think, or at least to think correctly. Revolutionary leaders cannot think without the people, nor for the people, but only with the people. Key phrase. Can't do without the people, can't do for the people. You're not supposed to have a revolution for the people. You're supposed to have a revolution with the people, right? And that's the big point, right, of the anti-dialogic idea. It's the idea you're going to do stuff for people, or you're going to tell people what to do because they don't know any better. And then they'll do it and everything will be good because you have the right ideas. Even if you do have the right ideas, you don't have the right idea about how to execute that. Because as long as people are not actively using their humanization, their humanity, in the process of transforming their world, they're not really going to transform it in any way that's going to be really different from the world that already exists, because they're just going to replicate unthinkingly what already exists, right? The dominant elites, on the other hand, can and do think without the people, although they do not permit themselves the luxury of failing to think about the people in order to know them better and thus dominate them more efficiently. Consequently, any apparent dialogue, or communication between the elites and the masses. Sorry about that. I sneezed, my hair fluffed out. I teased my hair out with a sneeze. It's hot. The dominant elites, on the other hand, can and do think without the people, although they do not permit themselves the luxury of failing to think about the people in order to know them better and thus dominate them more efficiently. Consequently, any apparent dialogue or communication between the elites and the masses is really the depositing of communiques, whose contents are intended to exercise a domesticating influence. Why do the dominant elites not become debilitated when they do not think with the people? Because the latter constitute their antithesis, their very reason for existence. If the elites were to think with the people, the contradiction would be superseded and they could no longer dominate. From the point of view of the dominators in any epoch, correct thinking presupposes the non-thinking of the people. Before I read this passage, let me look at Hunter's comment. I'm like 20 minutes late, but you can literally just replace all the human versus animal things by just saying as living beings we can overcome living situations instead of as humans versus animals who can't. Well, the retort would be that since animals don't overcome their limit situations and human beings are animals, they're both living beings, and plants are also living beings. But plants and animals cannot overcome their limit situations. Then why are we any different? Right? We look at ourselves the same way we look at a plant and say, just like that plant, I can't overcome this limit situation. This is the only thing in nature that exists. This is the only way to be a living being, is to be stuck in a situation, to be fully embedded in it. And I think a lot of people do have that kind of idea. They internalize that kind of idea, right? And so this is where the argument pans out, where it's like, okay, well, they don't do that, but that doesn't mean that you can't do that as a human being, right? A Mr. Giddy, later president of the Royal Society, raised objections which could be matched in every country. However specious in theory the project might be of giving education to the laboring classes of the poor, it would be prejudicial to their morals and happiness. It would teach them to despise their lot in life instead of making them good servants in agricultural and other laborious employments. Instead of teaching them subordination, it would render them fractious and refractory, as was evident in the manufacturing counties. It would enable them to read seditious pamphlets, vicious books, and publications against Christianity. It would render them insolent to their superiors, and in a few years, the legislature would find it necessary to direct the strong arm of power against them. Note 8, Niebuhr, Opsite, pages 117, 118. What Mr. Giddy really wanted, and what the elites of today want, although they do not denounce popular education so cynically and openly, yet, that was my editorializing, yet, was for the people not to think. Since the Mr. Giddys of all epochs as an oppressor class cannot think with the people, neither can they let the people think for themselves. The same is not true, however, of revolutionary leaders. If they do not think with the people, they become devitalized. I don't know what that noise is. The people are their constituent matrix, not mere objects thought of. Although revolutionary leaders may also have to think about the people in order to understand them better, this thinking differs from that of the elite. For in thinking about the people in order to liberate, rather than dominate them, the leaders give of themselves to the thinking of the people. One is the thinking of the master, the other is the thinking of the comrade. Domination, by its very nature, requires only a dominant pole and a dominated pole in antithetical contradiction. Revolutionary liberation, which attempts to resolve this contradiction, implies the existence not only of these poles, but also of a leadership group which emerges during this attempt. This leadership group either identifies itself with the oppressed state of the people, or it is not revolutionary. To simply think about the people, as the dominators do, without any self-giving in that thought, to fail to think with the people, is a sure way to cease being revolutionary leaders. In the process of oppression, the elites subsist on the living death of the oppressed and find their authentication in the vertical relationship between themselves and the latter. In the revolutionary process, there is only one way for the emerging leaders to achieve authenticity. They must die, quote unquote, in order to be reborn through and with the oppressed. We can legitimately say that in the process of oppression, someone oppresses someone else. We cannot say that in the process of revolution, someone liberates someone else. Not yet, nor yet that someone liberates himself, but rather that human beings in communion liberate each other. This affirmation is not meant to undervalue the importance of revolutionary leaders, but on the contrary, to emphasize their value. What could be more important than to live and work with the oppressed, with the rejects of life, with the wretched of the earth? In this communion, the revolutionary leaders should find not only their raison d'etre, but a motive for rejoicing. By their very nature, revolutionary leaders can do what the dominant elites, by their very nature, are unable to do in authentic terms. And remember that this is the nature of that positionality, not the nature of an individual person. Because again, in order for a person to leave that position of being the dominator, that part of themselves has to die, right? But they can become then a new person. But as long as they are the dominator in that positionality, they are just never going to be able to be with the people. You can't be with the people and also dominate them. You can't be with somebody that you also dominate, right? You just are doing things for them, you control them. And that is honestly an important kind of concept. I think it's an important kind of concept because sometimes we like have these moral questions, right? You know, what's the problem with the world? And when is it right to do something that could be seen as violent or could be seen as, you know, illegal or rebellious in a potentially unsavory way? Or how do we keep a moral compass, you know, in general? And I think one of the quicker ways to answer that is just to say that the problem is domination. And so doing something that reifies domination, that reasserts domination, that entrenches domination, doing something for domination, that is a problem. That is a problem, right? That is the problem, really. Every approach to the oppressed by the elites as a class is couched in terms of the false generosity described in Chapter 1. But the revolutionary leaders cannot be falsely generous, nor can they manipulate. Whereas the oppressor elites flourish by trampling the people underfoot, the revolutionary leaders can flourish only in communion with the people. Thus, it is that the activity of the oppressor cannot be humanist, while that of the revolutionary is necessarily so. The inhumanity of the oppressors and revolutionary humanism both make use of science. But science and technology at the service of the former are used to reduce the oppressed to the status of things. At the service of the latter, they are used to promote humanization. The oppressed must become subjects of the latter process, however, lest they continue to be seen as mere objects of scientific interest. Scientific revolutionary humanism cannot, in the name of revolution, treat the oppressed as objects to be analyzed and, based on that analysis, presented with prescriptions for behavior. To do this would be to fall into one of the myths of the oppressor ideology, the absolutizing of ignorance. Very key stuff here. Pay attention. Pay attention. Slaps ruler. This myth implies the existence of someone who decrees the ignorance of someone else. The one who is doing the decreeing defines himself and the class to which he belongs as those who know or were born to know. He thereby defines others as alien entities. The words of his own class come to be the true words, which he imposes or attempts to impose on the others. The oppressed, whose words have been stolen from them. Those who steal the words of others develop a deep doubt in the abilities of the others and consider them incompetent. Each time they say their word without hearing the word of those whom they have forbidden to speak, they grow more accustomed to power and acquire a taste for guiding, ordering, and commanding. They can no longer live without having someone to give orders to. Under these circumstances, dialogue is impossible. Now, we've all been in relationships, for instance, in situations with friends or even dating sometimes. Oftentimes, men are the ones who are, usually unwittingly, constantly trying to be in a dominant position. This is what I think the root of a lot of maybe feminist critique or gender critique of masculinity, toxic masculinity, some people say, or just in general, these bad habits that dudes do, these things that are essential to what endangers women, what hurts women, and what subjugates women. It's just this inability to let go of the need for control. And so everything has to be a sort of game of control, a game of power, a game of dominance over a situation. And you often find yourself in these situations where maybe the girl is constantly just not letting her voice be heard and just allowing the boy to speak, to dictate, to guide, to order, to command. And when the girl doesn't follow along, the guy's like, what's wrong with her? You know, she's crazy. And this is one of the reflections of like what happens in oppression and oppressive societies, in class societies, right? You have men in a different class from women, and so their socialization is to be the dominator. And despite even how much more women will know about so many things, in individual situations, let's say, the man will still be like, okay, well, like, it's on my terms, right? Like, it's got to be on my terms, and I gotta, and it's seen to them as like a type of oppression almost. Well, what about me? What about us, right? Why are you unfairly like not hearing me out? And it's like, why do you feel like being dominant in a social situation is the same as being treated unfairly and not being heard out? And so this situation sort of plays out across all the lines of oppressed dynamics. Rich and poor, white and not white, white and indigenous, right? Colonizer and colonized, let's say. White and black, same thing in a sense. And yes, as Intercept points out, very prevalent in parent-child relationships. The parent-child relationship is inherently oppressive. It is what it is. Like the family unit, the parent-child relationship, as we teach it, is an oppressive situation. It is a situation where the children are the lowest on the rung as the oppressed. And then, the vast majority of times, the woman is the second oppressed, the middle class, and the man is the upper class. The man can sort of do what he wants and be treated with respect. And every time he shows up and does something nice, it's seen as like, wow, what a great man. But showing up and doing something nice is like, the standard for the woman to do. It's, inconsiderate if they are not constantly showing up and putting their ass on the line and being nice. And for the children, well, don't even bother to have agency. I mean, oftentimes, because there are these three different classes, the children are put in the situation of being then the whipping post or the whipping child of the woman, the mother, right? And so they grow up in those environments, those toxic environments, and the mom oppresses the child as well as the dad, who oppresses the mom. This is the sort of traditional heterosexual family unit as we know it, and that exists because when you organize families that way, then within families you have organizations of power. And who am I speaking to? Who's the man of the house, right? So that organizes a society easier because it's like a territory. So when the person who owns the village, who runs the village, needs to organize each family, he can just order the man to do the thing, and the man will simply follow orders. And when the man follows orders, in order to rectify his lack of following orders, right, or in order to rectify the fact that he is subjugated, he has this family which he owns, this territory, right? And that also allows for a difficulty in having families work together within the unit and across different units, because now there is competition within the family unit and then competition amongst each different family unit. They are focused on trying to outdo each other more than they're trying to work together, because it's always a race to be in the higher class rather than to end the class system in general. And then the child may go to school and bully a weaker classmate. Exactly, Stephanie. This is how our societies work, and they work that way because that way, as long as you're in that top position, that's all you got to worry about. They work, and that allows for the people who are in top positions to maintain their control. right? Because everybody else is trying to up their position rather than work together to end that positionality, that structure. Divided we fall, and so on and so forth. So that was my little tangent on that. Scientific and humanist revolutionary leaders, on the other hand, cannot believe in the myth of the ignorance of the people. The siren in the background. They do not have the right to doubt for a single moment that it is only a myth. They cannot believe that they and only they know anything, for this means to doubt the people. Although they may legitimately recognize themselves as having, due to their revolutionary consciousness, a level of revolutionary knowledge different from the level of empirical knowledge held by the people, they cannot impose themselves and their knowledge on the people. They cannot sloganize the people, but must enter into dialogue with them, so that the people's empirical knowledge of reality, nourished by the leaders as critical knowledge, gradually becomes transformed into knowledge of the causes of reality. So if you have any takeaways, right, take this away, right? Well, you can take whatever you want away, but this is a great candidate for what you take away from this chapter, from this book, from this stream. You cannot, if you are trying to be engaged in transforming society, in this case we are saying revolutionary leaders, right? That's what revolutionary leaders do. They lead the revolution. What is the revolution? The transformation of society into a new egalitarian society. If you're trying to make the world a better place, and not just marginally better, but like really transform the world for the better, there's no room for you to believe in the myth of the ignorance of the people. And I know that that is very tempting, and it's also controversial. But this is the thing I run into the absolute most. It is one of the key ways where that people are dominated, because they just believe that everybody else is completely ignorant. And so we just reinforce that over and over again. And you have great reason to feel frustration and doubt about people being dumb, people being ignorant, people never knowing what's good for them. There's plenty of historical record that indicates that people will often do things that are very bad for them. But Freire distinguishes that this is because of a lack of consciousness. Okay? They've not been made conscious of the way the world works and what's sort of, the larger reality that they can do something about the world, essentially. That's what the conscientization, consciousness, the critical consciousness is all about. It's about having that deep belief, ultimately, that what you do can matter in the transformation of the world to being a better place. If you lack that belief, you're not going to do anything critically conscious. You're not going to do anything revolutionary. Especially not on purpose. Hey, Michael Jackson forever. What's up? Yes. Good etymological extrapolation. Okay. It would be naive to expect oppressor elites to denounce the myth which absolutizes the ignorance of the people. It would be a contradiction in terms if revolutionary leaders were not to do so, and more contradictory still, were they to act in accordance with that myth. The task of revolutionary leaders is to pose as problems not only this myth, but all the other myths used by the oppressor elites to oppress. If instead, revolutionary leaders persist in imitating the oppressors' methods of domination, the people may respond in either of two ways. In certain historical circumstances, they may become domesticated by the new contents which the leaders deposit in them. In other circumstances, they may become frightened by a word which threatens the oppressor housed within them. In neither event do they become revolutionary. In the first case, the revolution is an illusion. In the second case, an impossibility. Excuse me? I'm doing a lot of burping. This is kind of normal for me, though. My apologies to all of you who have had to deal with that through these streams. Note 9. Sometimes this word is not even spoken. the presence of someone, not necessarily belonging to a revolutionary group, who can threaten the oppressor housed in the people, is sufficient for the latter to assume destructive positions. A student once told me how, in a certain Latin American peasant community, a fanatical priest had denounced the presence in the community of two communists who were endangering what he called the Catholic faith. That very night, the peasants, to a man, joined together to burn alive the two simple elementary school teachers who had been educating the local children. Perhaps that priest had seen in the house of the teachers a book with a bearded man on the cover, meaning Karl Marx. And so, yeah, in a sense, right? And the reason people do these things, and this is what helps reinforce the oppressor's myth that the people are ignorant. But the reason the people do these things is because, according to Freire, they become frightened by something which threatens the oppressor housed within them. If you grow up in a household, you internalize the way that the people who raised you act. That's just the normal part of life. That's how you live. The people around you become models for how you act, especially when you're not critically thinking about them, which when you are a baby and very young and not given this kind of education at any point. So as you grow up, you're not able to do that. You haven't gotten that education. You haven't reached that consciousness. You internalize that. And that's for worse or for better, right? So if you have great parents, you internalize a lot of the great things about them, right? Likewise, if you are in a society where it's oppressive, you live in an oppressor society, you internalize the oppressor. That's the point, right? And so when you internalize the oppressor, psychologically, something that threatens the oppressor, you feel threatens you. For instance, if something threatens the idea of a traditional masculinity that you grew up with, that you internalized as a guy, even if you're not conscious of it, especially if you're not conscious of it, you start to just act kind of maliciously toward it or try to avoid it or rebel against it, right? Because you haven't had that consciousness to sit there and be like, I've housed in me something bad. And so, of course, I feel fear because something is going to die inside me. I'm accurate in saying that something is going to die inside me. And I haven't been given the confidence. I haven't been shown that when that thing dies inside me, that something better can be born instead. That I can be born anew as somebody critically conscious. Somebody truly able to be liberated. Truly in the process of liberating others and being liberated by others. Truly in the process of trying to get free. And so, one last point before I keep going. The first step is also to always acknowledge those things, right? Because if you can't acknowledge that a problem exists, how can you do anything about it? Basic logic, right? We all have internalized the things that we are closest to, the world that we inhabit, I should say. And so we have to know that there are oppressor bodies in us. The oppressor is housed within us. And likewise, the oppressor is housed within other people. If ever we put ourselves in the position where we look at a situation and we're like, well, I am the oppressed. There is no oppressor in my body. There is no oppressor in my brain. I've not internalized anything oppressive. So this person is just wrong. Even if you are led to the right conclusion, you did so the wrong way. Your formula was wrong. Even if you got the problem right in a math class. And so that means you don't really understand. Only when you acknowledge that all of us have internalized oppressive things within us can we do the work to try to cleanse that out of us, to try to, let that part die out of us and emerge anew and better. And also, can we really evaluate for instance, dialogue that occurs between us and other people. Because we get to say, okay, so I have oppressor in me and you have the oppressor in me. I have fault in me. I have evil in me, we can say, and you have evil in you. So there's a potential for both of us to be right or wrong. Now, knowing that, let's look at the situation and say, who is more right or wrong? Let's look at the situation and say, what are the parts that we can be subjective about? What are the parts that we should be objective about? Etc. Oop. That's what you get for talking with your hands. Some well-intentioned but misguided persons suppose that since the dialogical process is prolonged, which incidentally is not true, they ought to carry out the revolution without communication, by means of communiques, and that once the revolution is won, they will then develop a thoroughgoing educational effort. Note 10. Once more, I wish to emphasize that there is no dichotomy between dialogue and revolutionary action. There is not one stage for dialogue and another for revolution. On the contrary, dialogue is the essence of revolutionary action. In the theory of this action, the actors intersubjectively direct their action upon an object, reality, which mediates them, with the humanization of men to be achieved by transforming that reality as their objective. In the theory of oppressor action, anti-dialogical in essence, the above scheme is simplified. The actors have as simultaneous objects of their action both reality and the oppressed, and the preservation of oppression through the preservation of oppressive reality as their objective. So, theory of revolutionary action. Intersubjectivity. Subjects, actors, revolutionary leaders. Actors, subjects, the oppressed. So you see how the subjects, actors, and actors, subjects, they're both, actors and subjects, but the revolutionary leaders call on that, their subjecthood first and act so that with the oppressed, that calls them to be subjects and actors, right? Whereas in the theory of oppressive action, you have actors, subjects, who are the dominant elites. They are the subjects, We should care only about famous and powerful people, right? Because they're the only people who have subjecthood. They're the only people who have power. The only people who can act. Okay. They further justify this procedures by saying that it is not possible to carry out education, liberating education, before taking power. It is worth analyzing some fundamental points of the above assertions. These men and women, or most of them, believe in the necessity for dialogue with the people, but do not believe this dialogue is feasible prior to taking power. When they deny the possibility that the leaders can behave in a critically educational fashion before taking power, they deny the revolution's educational quality as cultural action preparing to become cultural revolution. On the other hand, they confuse cultural action with the new education to be inaugurated once power is taken. I have already affirmed that it would indeed be naive to expect the oppressor elites to carry out a liberating education. But because the revolution undeniably has an educational nature, in the sense that unless it liberates, it is not revolution, the taking of power is only one moment, no matter how decisive, in the revolutionary process. As process, the before of the revolution is located within the oppressor society and is apparent only to the revolutionary consciousness. The revolution is born as a social entity within the oppressor society. To the extent that it is cultural action, it cannot fail to correspond to the potentialities of the social entity in which it originated. Every entity develops or is transformed within itself through the interplay of its contradictions. External conditioners, while necessary, are effective only if they coincide with those potentialities. This is an extension of the chart from number 10. So in the theory of revolutionary action, you have intersubjectivity, you have subjects, actors, and actors, subjects. You have an interaction with them. The object with mediates, the reality transformed to the object with mediates. and then each objective from each of them for humanization as a permanent process. This is kind of a complicated chart to look at, but essentially it's just reaffirming what he's talking about. With revolutionary action, revolutionary thinking, nobody is, dictating for others. We are both working together. We are all working together. Even though we are knowing that we have flaws that make us work against each other, we are still in the process. We engage with our lives as processes and thus come together in that process. Whereas in the oppressive thinking, there is no process. There is just reality. The process will just bring you back to what's real. We'll just bring you back to the ultimate thing that is ultimately ultimate, right? And so you, as the person without power, as the person without knowledge, as the person who is lesser than me, should sit down and absorb as much as I am kind enough to give you so that you can one day be in a position similar to mine. Where was I? I'll start from here. The revolution is born as a social entity within the oppressor society. To the extent that it is cultural action, it cannot fail to correspond to the potentialities of the social entity in which it originated. Every entity develops or is transformed within itself through the interplay of its contradictions. External conditioners, while necessary, are effective only if they coincide with those potentialities. Number 11, see Mao Zedong. The newness of the revolution is generated within the old oppressive society. The taking of power constitutes only a decisive moment of the continuing revolutionary process. In a dynamic, rather than static, view of revolution, there is no absolute before or after, with the taking of power as the dividing line. Intercept says, so a revolutionary leader is not a leader in the traditional sense of the word. I guess you could say that, yeah. Michael Jackson forever. What reminds me of what we talked about in school when we learned about the Nazi regime. A conclusion we kind of came to was everyone has potential for doing bad things or good things. Another we also concluded was that pretty much everyone can/has internalized stereotypes about others. What matters is that you basically stay open to being proven wrong/learning more. Yeah, I think that's maybe a more like a smaller version of it. I think that there's more stuff that the kind of stuff that we were taught in school. I think that the ways that Freire expounds from that are important in the sense of understanding it as a revolutionary thing, as a way, as a need to continuously do this to transform society, because otherwise, it's like, okay, I'll stay open, but since I don't have like a goal in mind for what to stay open for, I can just set my own kind of goal, and then I'm just kind of staying open only to things that benefit that goal. Whereas Freire says, hey, we have a goal. Our goal is to be transforming society, to resolve the contradiction between oppressor and oppressed, to end oppression, right? To cause liberation, right? And of course, this is a very wide idea and its scope, a bit abstract, but that's where he has these ideas fleshed out more in this book. But regardless, yeah, it allows you to then anchor the way that you think about the world to, hey, am I thinking in a way that is transforming reality, or am I stuck in my ways, right? Am I stuck in the ways that are oppressive? Originating in objective conditions, revolution seeks to supersede the situation of oppression by inaugurating a society of women and men in the process of continuing liberation. The educational, dialogical quality of revolution, which makes it a cultural revolution as well, must be present in all its stages. Damn. This educational quality is one of the most effective instruments for keeping the revolution from becoming institutionalized and stratified in a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy. For counter-revolution is carried out by revolutionaries who become reactionary. Were it not possible to dialogue with the people before power is taken because they have no experience with dialogue, neither would it be possible for the people to come to power, for they are equally inexperienced in the use of power. The revolutionary process is dynamic, and it is in this continuing dynamics, in the praxis of the people with the revolutionary leaders, that the people and the leaders will learn both dialogue and the use of power. This is as obvious as affirming that a person learns to swim in the water, not in a library. Useful metaphor. Dialogue with the people is neither a concession nor a gift, much less a tactic to be used for domination. Dialogue, as the encounter among men to name the world, is a fundamental precondition for their true humanization. In the words of Gayo Petrovich, a free action can only be one by which a man changes his world and himself. A positive condition of freedom is the knowledge of the limits of necessity, the awareness of human creative possibilities. The struggle for a free society is not a struggle for a free society unless through it an ever greater degree of individual freedom is created. Note 12, Gayo Petrovich, Man in Freedom and Socialist Humanism, by the same author, see Marx in the mid-20th century. So we can also look at history that way, right? This is helpful in that sense because when we look back and we try to evaluate, hey, was this thing good or bad? Was this truly a revolutionary movement or something that was approximating a revolutionary movement? Because nothing has really super fucking succeeded. Like nothing has like nailed it in terms of bringing the revolution home and ending class society and all that. But can we look at a struggle and say, hey, I know that this was a struggle for a free society. I know that this was a revolutionary struggle because I see that after it, greater freedoms were created. They changed the world. They changed some things for the better, right? If this view be true, the revolutionary process is eminently educational in character. Thus, the road to revolution involves openness to the people, not imperviousness to them. It involves communion with the people, not mistrust. And, as Lenin pointed out, the more a revolution requires theory, the more its leaders must be with the people in order to stand against the power of oppression. Based on these general propositions, let us undertake a more lengthy analysis of the theories of anti-dialogical and dialogical action. And so now we get into the sections. Hope you're doing well so far, guys. Conquest. The first characteristic of anti-dialogical action is the necessity for conquest. The anti-dialogical individual, in his relations with others, aims at conquering them, increasingly and by every means, from the toughest to the most refined, from the most repressive to the most solicitous, paternalism. Every act of conquest implies a conqueror and someone or something which is conquered. The conqueror imposes his objectives on the vanquished and makes of them his possession. He imposes his own contours on the vanquished, who internalize this shape and become ambiguous beings housing another. From the first, the act of conquest, which reduces persons to the status of things, is necrophilic. Necrophilic, it loves death. That's a way you can define that word. 107, again, I'm late, but I would argue that plants and animals try and do overcome their limit situations. Like crows or raccoons able to solve puzzles / use dexterity to get to food limited from them. Yeah, I think that that's a fair point. I do think that that's a fair point, and I think that that's a subject for a larger conversation or a separate conversation. But it is one of those things that, yeah, for this reason, I feel some discomfort with the way Freire uses that. I think maybe the difference is that maybe you could argue that despite these animals using this kind of creativity to overcome limit situations, it's purely in an individualist sort of response to a situation that is thrust upon them, rather than transforming that situation by organizing with other animals. But I think there are potentially ways that you could say, no, animals do organize to transform situations as well. I would be hard pressed to know that. I'm very bad at animal science. So I think that that's a subject that I would love to dig into more, and be able to study more, Just as anti-dialogical action is a concomitant of the real concrete situation of oppression. Concomitant is like something that occurs alongside it, and necessitates it at the same time, right? Like it's concomitant because it's necessitated by this thing and it necessitates this thing, right? So they both come together, basically. That's fair, at least. Yeah. Just as anti-dialogical action is a concomitant of the real concrete situation of oppression, dialogical action is indispensable to the revolutionary supersedence of that situation. An individual is not anti-dialogical or dialogical in the abstract, but in the world. He or she is not first anti-dialogical, then oppressor, but both simultaneously. Within an objective situation of oppression, anti-dialogue is necessary to the oppressor as a means of further oppression, not only economic, but cultural. The vanquished are dispossessed of their word, their expressiveness, their culture. Further, once a situation of oppression has been initiated, anti-dialogue becomes indispensable to its preservation. Stephanie says, then when a revolutionary leader establishes a new order and becomes that leader, they cannot avoid becoming dominant and thus disengaging from the dialogue. Is that inevitable? It's not necessarily inevitable, but at this phase, it's very hard to conceive of that not happening, because, that's how revolutions tend to shake out. And this is something that we have to overcome, right? So it's something that, depending on how the revolutionary leader goes about it, they can kind of negate that reality that often comes, where they can be like, well, yeah, I am still sort of the head honcho, so to speak. I don't really like using that term. I am sort of the leader here. And we have thrust out the old society, and now I am the ruler, but I'm going to implement things to where, I undermine my own power, or I, work towards making things more egalitarian in certain things, right? But just as everybody is flawed and every generation has its things that it's stuck with, in a sense, we have to keep overcoming more and more of the problems that are posed by these sorts of revolutionary attempts, with each revolutionary attempt sort of chipping away until we get into the one that sort of overcomes this limit situation, let's say. Animals do basically have a culture. Yeah, that's also a fair point, MJ. Because liberating action is dialogical in nature, dialogue cannot be a posteriori to that action, but must be concomitant with it. And since liberation must be a permanent condition, dialogue becomes a continuing aspect of liberating action. Number 13. Once a popular revolution has come to power, the fact that the new power has the ethical duty to repress any attempt to restore the old oppressive power by no means signifies that the revolution is contradicting its dialogical character. Dialogue between the former oppressors and the oppressed as antagonistic classes was not possible before the revolution. It continues to be impossible afterward. So, in essence, it's not oppression when the oppressed take power and then kick out the former oppressors, or when counter revolutions pop up and the oppressors try to take power again. Fighting them off, let's say, is not them being oppressors, right? That's just them recognizing, no, you're still trying to be the oppressor here, right? And yes, of course, there's some messiness in terms of what constitutes a person being the oppressor or whatnot, But a lot of the times it's really not that complicated. You know, what are the intentions? Are the intentions like ownership concentrated to a small hand of individual elites who wish to implement, exploitative structures? Yeah, I think, Stephanie, that sort of gets a bit at what I'm saying. I mean, yeah, there are always going to be flaws and failures on that end because it's hard enough to get to that position to begin with. But yeah, the goal is that they recognize that they're not really the point, and that they are, not trying to emulate the former oppressor. So they take a position similar to the former oppressor, but they change that position. They change it as much as they can to mean something different, to be, in effect, something different. The desire for conquest, or rather the necessity of conquest, is at all times present in anti-dialogical action. It's a hard breath. To this end, the oppressors attempt to destroy in the oppressed their quality as considerers of the world. Since the oppressors cannot totally achieve this destruction, they must mythicize the world. In order to present for the consideration of the oppressed and subjugated a world of deceit designed to increase their alienation and passivity, the oppressors develop a series of methods precluding any presentation of the world as a problem and showing it rather as a fixed entity, as something given, something to which people, as mere spectators, must adapt. It is necessary for the oppressors to approach the people in order, via subjugation, to keep them passive. This approximation, however, does not involve being with the people or require true communication. It is accomplished by the oppressors' depositing myths, indispensable to the preservation of the status quo. For example, the myth that the oppressive order is a free society. The myth that all persons are free to work where they wish, that if they don't like their boss, they can leave him and look for another job. The myth that this order respects human rights and is therefore worthy of esteem. The myth that anyone who is industrious can become an entrepreneur. Worse yet, the myth that the street vendor is as much an entrepreneur as the owner of a large factory. The myth of the universal right of education, when all the Brazilian children who enter primary schools, only a tiny fraction ever reach the university. I don't know if y'all hear that, but there's some noise. The myth of the equality of all individuals, when the question, "Do you know who you're talking to?" is still current among us. The myth of the heroism of the oppressor classes as defenders of Western Christian civilization against materialist barbarism. The myth of the charity and generosity of the elites, when what they really do as a class is to foster selective good deeds, subsequently elaborated into the myth of disinterested aid, which on the international level was severely criticized by Pope John XXIII. The myth that the dominant elites, recognizing their duties, promote the advancement of the people so that the people, in a gesture of gratitude, should accept the words of the elites and be conformed to them. And I think that's the distinction that's also pretty helpful for what your point is, Stephanie. So it's not even just promoting the advancement of the people, but it's about promoting the people's agency over the dominant person, or the person in a more dominant position. When you're in a situation where you're dominant over somebody, the thing you should be trying to do is end that domination, right? Stop that from happening. The myth that rebellion is a sin against God. The myth of private property as fundamental to personal human development, so long as oppressors are the only true human beings. The myth of the industriousness of the oppressors and the laziness and dishonesty of the oppressed, as well as the myth of the natural inferiority of the latter and the superiority of the former. More burps. Note 14. To your point, Azdic. Moreover, economically developed countries should take particular care lest, in giving aid to poorer countries, they endeavor to turn the prevailing political situation to their own advantage and seek to dominate them. Should perchance such attempts be made, this clearly would be but another form of colonialism, which, although disguised in name, merely reflects their earlier but outdated dominion, now abandoned by many countries. When international relations are thus obstructed, the orderly progress of all peoples is endangered. And that was Pope John the 23rd. Maybe I should do a video about Pope John the 23rd. He was pretty cool. And then also note 15, Memi refers to the image the colonizer constructs of the colonized. By his accusation, the colonizer establishes the colonized as being lazy. He decides that laziness is constitutional in the very nature of the colonized. It's page 81 of something. Paulo Freire is psychic. All these myths, and others the readers could list, the internalization of which is essential to the subjugation of the oppressed, are presented to them by well-organized propaganda and slogans via the mass communications media, as if such alienation constituted real communication. 16. Note 16, it is not the media themselves which I criticize, but the way they are used. Oh, I was just checking to see if there was more there. In sum, there is no oppressive reality which is not at the same time necessarily anti-dialogical, just as there is no anti-dialogue in which the oppressors do not untiringly dedicate themselves to the constant conquest of the oppressed. In ancient Rome, the dominant elites spoke of the need to give bread and circus to the people in order to soften them up and to secure their own tranquility. The dominant elites of today, like those of any epoch, continue, in a version of original sin, to need to conquer others, with or without bread and circus. The content and methods of conquest vary historically. What does not vary, as long as dominant elites exist, is the necrophilic passion to oppress. Divide and rule. This is another fundamental dimension of the theory of oppressive action, which is as old as oppression itself. We talked about that a bit earlier too. As the oppressor minority subordinates and dominates the majority, it must divide it and keep it divided in order to remain in power. The minority cannot permit itself the luxury of tolerating the unification of the people, which would undoubtedly signify a serious threat to their own hegemony. Accordingly, the oppressors halt by any method, including violence, any action which in even incipient fashion could awaken the oppressed to the need for unity. Concepts such as unity, organization, and struggle are immediately labeled as dangerous. In fact, of course, these concepts are dangerous to the oppressors, for their realization is necessary to the actions of liberation. It is in the interest of the oppressor to weaken the oppressed still further, to isolate them, to create and deepen rifts among them. This is done by varied means, from the repressive methods of the government bureaucracy to the forms of cultural action with which they manipulate the people by giving them the impression that they are being helped. One of the characteristics of oppressive cultural action, which is almost never perceived by the dedicated but naive professionals who are involved, is the emphasis on a focalized view of problems rather than on seeing them as dimensions of a totality. In community development projects, the more a region or area is broken down into local communities, without the study of these communities both as totalities in themselves and as parts of another totality, the area, region, and so forth, which in its turn is part of a still larger totality, the nation as part of the continental totality, the more alienation is intensified. And the more alienated people are, the easier it is to divide them and keep them divided. These focalized forms of action, by intensifying the focalized way of life of the oppressed, especially in rural areas, hamper the oppressed from perceiving reality critically and keep them isolated from the problems of oppressed women and men in other areas. Note 17. This criticism, of course, does not apply to actions within a dialectical perspective, based on the understanding of the local community both as a totality in itself and as part of a larger totality. It is directed at those who do not realize that the development of the local community cannot occur except in the total context of which it is a part, in interaction with other parts. This requirement implies the consciousness of unity in diversification, of organization which channels forces in dispersion, and a clear awareness of the necessity to transform reality. This, understandably, is what frightens the oppressors. The same divisive effect occurs in connection with the so-called leadership training courses, which are, although carried out without any such intention by many of their organizers, in the last analysis alienating. These courses are based on the naive assumption that one can promote the community by training its leaders, as if it were the parts that promote the whole and not the whole which, in being promoted, promotes the parts. Those members of the communities who show sufficient leadership capacities to be chosen for these courses necessarily reflect and express the aspirations of the individuals of their community. They are in harmony with the way of living and thinking about reality which characterizes their comrades, even though they reveal special abilities which give them the status of leaders. As soon as they complete the course and return to the community with resources they did not formerly possess, they either use these resources to control the submerged and dominated consciousness of their comrades, or they become strangers in their own communities, and their former leadership position is thus threatened. In order not to lose their leadership status, they will probably tend to continue manipulating the community, but in a more efficient manner. When cultural action, as a totalized and totalizing process, approaches an entire community and not merely its leaders, the opposite process occurs. Either the former leaders grow along with everyone else, or they are replaced by new leaders who emerge as a result of the new social consciousness of the community. The oppressors do not favor promoting the community as a whole, but rather selected leaders. The latter course, by preserving a state of alienation, hinders the emergence of consciousness and critical intervention in a total reality. And without that critical intervention, it is always difficult to achieve the unity of the oppressed as a class. Class conflict is another concept which upsets the oppressors, since they do not wish to consider themselves an oppressive class. Unable to deny, try as they may, the existence of social classes, they preach the need for understanding and harmony between those who buy and those who are obliged to sell their labor. Note 18. Bishop Frank Split refers eloquently to this point. If the workers do not become in some way the owners of their labor, all structural reforms will be ineffective. This is true even if the workers receive a higher salary in an economic system but are not content with these raises. They want to be owners, not sellers of their labor. At present, the workers are increasingly aware that labor represents a part of the human person. A person, however, cannot be bought, neither can he sell himself. Any purchase or sale of labor is a type of slavery. The evolution of human society in this respect is clearly progressing within a system said to be less responsive than our own to the question of human dignity, i.e. Marxism. 15 obispos hablan en el prol del tercer mundo, from Mexico, 1967. However, the unconcealable antagonism which exists between the two classes makes this harmony impossible. note 19. With respect to social classes and the struggle between them, which Karl Marx is often accused of inventing, see Marx's letter to J. Wedemeyer, dated March 1st, 1852. Marx voice. No credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, 1, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. 2, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to classless society. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, Selected Works, 1968. The elites call for harmony between classes as if classes were fortuitous agglomerations of individuals curiously looking at a shop window on a Sunday afternoon. The only harmony which is viable and demonstrable is that found among the oppressors themselves. Although they may diverge and, upon occasion, even clash over group interests, they unite immediately at a threat to the class. We see this all the time. Rich people fight each other all the time, except when the poor start fighting the rich. And then the rich all band together like the Avengers. Similarly, the harmony of the oppressed is only possible when its members are engaged in the struggle for liberation. Only in exceptional cases is it not only possible but necessary for both classes to unite and act in harmony. But when the emergency which united them has passed, they will return to the contradiction which defines their existence and which never really disappeared. Elise asks, does the book further touch on how to reach the people? I find it very frustrating when people refuse to talk about anything political. In that sense, philosophy too has been helpful. I think chapter 3 would be good for that. Chapter 3 is good in terms of understanding like how to build an educational group, essentially. The process of investigating the themes of those people's lives, understanding what they are, and then posing problems to them. That's what the essence of what Freire's book is about and his teaching is about. You reach people by problem posing education. That is how you build dialogue with them.
New donation from Cheba.
Thank you for the donation, Cheba. You reach people through dialogue, right? And you reach them not because you're reaching them to tell them what to do. That's important to remember. But that you're reaching them so that you can be in conversation with them. You want to engage with them in a conversation. And so you do that through posing a problem to them. And for more on that, you want to read chapter 3. I won't get into it too much. But he'll get into it a bit here as well. So there'll be more opportunity to sort of discuss that a bit. Where was I? Yeah, only in exceptional cases is it not only possible, but necessary for both classes to unite and act in harmony, like a war or something, or aliens invading. But when the emergency which united them has passed, they will return to the contradiction which defines their existence and which never really disappeared. All the actions of the dominant class manifest its need to divide in order to facilitate the preservation of the oppressor state. Its interference in the unions favoring certain representatives of the dominated classes, who actually represent the oppressor, not their own comrades. Its promotion of individuals who reveal leadership capacity and could signify a threat if they were not softened up in this way. Its distribution of benefits to some and penalties to others. All these are ways of dividing in order to preserve the system which favors the elite. They are forms of action which exploit, directly or indirectly, one of the weak points of the oppressed, their basic insecurity. The oppressed are insecure in their duality as beings which house the oppressor. On the one hand, they resist her or him On the other hand, at a certain stage in their relationship, they are attracted by him or her. Under these circumstances, the oppressors easily obtain positive results from divisive action. In addition, the oppressed know from experience the price of not accepting an invitation offered with the purpose of preventing their unity as a class. Losing their jobs and finding their names on a blacklist, signifying closed doors to other jobs, is the least that can happen. Their basic insecurity is thus directly linked to the enslavement of their labor, which really implies the enslavement of their person, as Bishop Split emphasized. People are fulfilled only to the extent that they create their world, which is a human world, and create it with their transforming labor. The fulfillment of humankind as human beings lies then in the fulfillment of the world. If for a person to be in the world of work is to be totally dependent, insecure, and permanently threatened, if their work does not belong to them, the person cannot be fulfilled. Work that is not free ceases to be a fulfilling pursuit and becomes an effective means of dehumanization. Every move by the oppressed towards unity points towards other actions. It means that sooner or later the oppressed will perceive their state of depersonalization and discover that as long as they are divided, they will always be easy prey for manipulation and domination. Unity and organization can enable them to change their weakness into a transforming force with which they can recreate the world and make it more human. Note 20. Sorry for wiping or rubbing my nose a lot, not wiping it. I'm not running, but let me not expound further. Note 20. For this reason, it is indispensable for the oppressors to keep the peasants isolated from the urban workers, just as it is indispensable to keep both groups isolated from the students. The testimony of rebellion of the latter, although they do not sociologically constitute a class, makes them dangerous in the event they join the people. It is thus necessary to convince the lower classes that students are irresponsible and disorderly, that their testimony is false because as students they should be studying, just as the factory workers and the peasants should be working towards the nation's progress. The more human world to which they justly aspire, however, is the antithesis of the human world of the oppressors. Excuse me? Damn. Are y'all hearing these? Coming from deep in my solar plexus. I am so sorry. The more human world to which they justly aspire, however, is the antithesis of the human world of the oppressors. A world which is the exclusive possession of the oppressors, who preach an impossible harmony between themselves, who dehumanize, and the oppressed, who are dehumanized. Since oppressors and oppressed are antithetical, what serves the interests of one group disserves the interests of the others. Dividing in order to preserve the status quo, then, is necessarily a fundamental objective of the theory of anti-dialogical action. In addition, the dominators tried to present themselves as saviors of the men and women they dehumanize and divide. Yes, I totally see what you mean. This messianism, however, cannot conceal their true intention to save themselves. They want to save their riches, their power, their way of life, the things that enable them to subjugate others. Their mistake is that men cannot save themselves, no matter how one understands salvation, either as individuals or as an oppressor class. Salvation can be achieved only with others. To the extent, however, that the elites oppress, they cannot be with the oppressed, for being against them is the essence of oppression. A psychoanalysis of oppressive action might reveal the false generosity of the oppressor, described in Chapter 1, as a dimension of the latter's sense of guilt. With this false generosity, he attempts not only to preserve an unjust and necrophilic order, but to buy peace for himself. It happens that peace cannot be bought. Peace is experienced in solidary and loving acts, which cannot be incarnated in oppression. Hence, the messianic element of the theory of anti-dialogical action reinforces the first characteristic of this action, the necessity for conquest. In other words, stop trying to be the Messiah. People who claim themselves to be the Messiah or messianic, very sus. But I didn't have to tell you that. Why is the landline in my room? Since it is necessary to divide the people in order to preserve the status quo and thereby the power of the dominators, it is essential for the oppressors to keep the oppressed from perceiving their strategy. So the former must convince the latter that they are being defended against the demonic action of marginals, rowdies, and enemies of God. For these are the epithets directed at men who lived and are living the brave pursuit of man's humanization. In order to divide and confuse the people, the destroyers call themselves builders and accuse the true builders of being destructive. History, however, always takes it upon itself to modify these designations. Today, although the official terminology continues to call Tiradentes a conspirator, inconfidenti, and the libertarian movement which he led a conspiracy, inconfidencia, the national hero is not the man who called Tiradentes a bandit, ordered him hanged and quartered, and had pieces of the bloody corpse strewn through the streets of the neighboring villages as an example. Okay, note 21, Tiradentes was the leader of an abortive revolt for the independence of Brazil from Portugal in 1789 in Ouro Preto, state of Minas Gerais. This movement is historically called the Inconfidencia Mineira. And note 22, this man is Visconde de Barbacena, royal administrator of the province. It is Tiradentes who is the hero. History tore up the title given him by the elites and recognized his action for what it was. It is the men who in their own time sought unity for liberation who are the heroes, not those who used their power to divide and rule. It's pretty old school, MJ. Manipulation. Manipulation is another dimension of the theory of anti-dialogical action, and, like the strategy of division, is an instrument of conquest, the objective around which all the dimensions of the theory revolve. By means of manipulation, the dominant elites try to conform the masses to their objectives, and the greater the political immaturity of these people, rural or urban, the more easily the latter can be manipulated by those who do not wish to lose their power. The people are manipulated by the series of myths described earlier in this chapter, and by yet another myth, the model of itself, which the bourgeoisie presents to the people as the possibility for their own ascent. In order for these myths to function, however, the people must accept the word of the bourgeoisie. Within certain historical conditions, manipulation is accomplished by means of pacts between the dominant and the dominated classes, pacts which, if considered superficially, might give the impression of a dialogue between the classes. In reality, however, these pacts are not dialogue because their true objectives are determined by the unequivocal interest of the dominant elites. In the last analysis, pacts are used by the dominators to achieve their own ends. Note 23, pacts are only valid for the masses, and in this case they are no longer pacts, when the objectives of the action in process or to be developed are subject to their decision. The support given by the people to the so-called national bourgeoisie in defense of so-called national capitalism is an example in point. Sooner or later, these pacts always increase the subjugation of the people. They are proposed only when the people begin, even naively, to emerge from the historical process, and by this emergence, to threaten the dominant elites. The presence of the people in the historical process, no longer as mere spectators, but with the first signs of aggressivity, is sufficiently disquieting to frighten the dominant elites into doubling the tactics of manipulation. So, more stuff that's reminiscent of what's happening at the universities, to your point, Ines. These administrations of these universities offering, crumbs, essentially, and shaking in their boots because of these demonstrations, these encampments. In this historical phase, manipulation becomes a fundamental instrument for the preservation of domination. Prior to the emergence of the people, there is no manipulation, precisely speaking, but rather total suppression. When the oppressed are almost completely submerged in reality, it is unnecessary to manipulate them. In the anti-dialogical theory of action, manipulation is the response of the oppressor to the new concrete conditions of the historical process. Through manipulation, the dominant elites can lead the people into an unauthentic type of organization, and can thus avoid the threatening alternative, the true organization of the emerged and emerging people. Note 24. In the organization which results from acts of manipulation, the people, mere guided objects, are adapted to the objectives of the manipulators. In true organization, the individuals are active in the organizing process, and the objectives of the organization are not imposed by others. In the first case, the organization is a means of massification. In the second, a means of liberation. In Brazilian political terminology, massification is the process of reducing the people to a manageable, unthinking agglomeration. The latter have only two possibilities as they enter the historical process. Either they must organize authentically for their liberation, or they will be manipulated by the elites. Authentic organization is obviously not going to be stimulated by the dominators. It is the task of the revolutionary leaders. It happens, however, that large sectors of the oppressed form an urban proletariat, especially in the more industrialized centers of the country. Although these sectors are occasionally restive, they lack revolutionary consciousness and consider themselves privileged. Manipulation, with its series of deceits and promises, usually finds fertile ground here. The antidote to manipulation lies in a critically conscious revolutionary organization, which will pose to the people as problems their position in the historical process, the national reality, and manipulation itself. In the words of Francisco Veffert, all the policies of the left are based on the masses and depend on the consciousness of the latter. If that consciousness is confused, the left will lose its roots and certain downfall will be imminent, although, as in the Brazilian case, the left may be deluded into thinking it can achieve the revolution by means of a quick return to power. Note 25, Francisco Veffert, Política de Massas. In a situation of manipulation, the left is almost always tempted by a quick return to power, forgets the necessity of joining with the oppressed to forge an organization, and strays into an impossible dialogue with the dominant elites. It ends by being manipulated by these elites, and not infrequently itself falls into an elitist game, which it calls realism. Manipulation, like the conquest whose objectives it serves, attempts to anesthetize the people so they will not think. For if the people join to their presence in the historical process critical thinking about that process, the threat of their emergence materializes in revolution. Whether one calls this correct thinking revolutionary consciousness or class consciousness, It is an indispensable precondition of revolution. The dominant elites are so well aware of this fact that they instinctively use all means, including physical violence, to keep the people from thinking. They have a shrewd intuition of the ability to dialogue, the ability of dialogue to develop a capacity for criticism. While some revolutionary leaders consider dialogue with the people a bourgeois and reactionary activity, the bourgeoisie regard dialogue between the oppressed and the revolutionary leaders as a very real danger to be avoided. One of the methods of manipulation is to inoculate individuals with the bourgeois appetite for personal success. This manipulation is sometimes carried out directly by the elites and sometimes indirectly through populist leaders. As Veffert points out, these leaders serve as intermediaries between the oligarchical elites and the people. The emergence of populism as a style of political action thus coincides causally with the emergence of the oppressed. The populist leader who rises from this process is an ambiguous being, an amphibian who lives in two elements. Shuttling back and forth between the people and the dominant oligarchies, he bears the marks of both groups. Since the populist leader simply manipulates, instead of fighting for authentic popular organization, this type of leader serves the revolution little, if at all. Only by abandoning his ambiguous character and dual action, and by opting decisively for the people, thus ceasing to be populist, does he renounce manipulation and dedicate himself to the revolutionary task of organization. At this point, he ceases to be an intermediary between the people and the elites, and becomes a contradiction of the latter. Thereupon, the elites immediately join forces to curb him. Observe the dramatic and finally unequivocal terms in which Getulio Vargas spoke to the workers at a May 1st celebration during his last period as head of state. I want to tell you that the gigantic work of renewal which my administration is beginning to carry out cannot be completed successfully without the support and the daily, steadfast cooperation of the workers. Okay, so and this is also relevant for Stephanie's inquiry. So note 26, I'm going to say Getulio Vargas actually, led the revolution which overthrew Brazilian President Washington Luiz in 1930. He remained in power as a dictator until 1945. In 1950, he returned to power as elected president. In August 1954, when the opposition was about to overthrow him, he committed suicide. Translator's note. Note 27, speech given in Vasco da Gama Stadium on May 1st, 1950, O Governo Trabalhista no Brasil. Vargas then spoke of his first 90 days in office, which he called an estimate of the difficulties and obstacles which, here and there, are being raised in opposition to the actions of the government. He spoke directly to the people about how deeply he felt the helplessness, poverty, the high cost of living, low salaries, the hopelessness of the unfortunate, and the demands of the majority who live in hope of better days. His appeal to the workers then took on more objective tones. I have come to say that at this moment, the administration does not yet have the laws or the concrete instruments for immediate action to defend the people's economy. It is thus necessary for the people to organize, not only to defend their own interests, but also to give the government the base of support it requires to carry out its objectives. I need your unity. I need for you, in solidarity, to organize yourselves in unions. I need for you to form a strong and cohesive bloc to stand beside the government so that it will have all the force it needs to solve your problems. I need your unity so that you can fight against saboteurs, so you do not fall prey to the interests of speculators and rapacious scoundrels in detriment of the interests of the people. The hour has come to appeal to the workers. Unite in your unions as free and organized forces. At the present time, no administration can survive or dispose of sufficient force to achieve its social ends if it does not have the support of the laboring organizations. Emphasis added. In this speech, Vargas appealed vehemently, appealed vehemently to the people to organize and to unite in defense of their rights. And he told them, as chief of state, of the obstacles, the hindrances, and the innumerable difficulties involved in governing with them. From that moment on, his administration encountered increasing difficulties until the tragic climax of August 1954. If Vargas had not, in his last term, shown such open encouragement to the organization of the people, subsequently linked to a series of measures in defense of the national interest, possibly the reactionary elites would not have taken the extreme measures they did. Any populist leader who moves, even discreetly, towards the people in any way other than as the intermediary of the oligarchies will be curbed by the latter, if they have sufficient force to stop him. But as long as the leader restricts himself to paternalism and social welfare activities, although there may be occasional divergencies between him and groups of oligarchies whose interests have been touched, deep differences are rare. This is the social democrat conversation, for instance, the Bernie bro conversation. Just give them like more social welfare programs, and that's it. And yeah, that'll cause beef between you and other elites, but they're really not going to bother with you. In fact, sometimes they like it when people give them small concessions. It's a very useful way of manipulating people. Hope you feel better soon. Thank you, Stephanie. Take care, Elise and Stephanie. This is because welfare programs as instruments of manipulation ultimately serve the end of conquest. They act as an anesthetic, distracting the oppressed from the true causes of their problems and from the concrete solution of these problems. They splinter the oppressed into groups of individuals hoping to get a few more benefits for themselves. This situation contains, however, a positive element. The individuals who receive some aid always want more. Those who do not receive aid, seeing the example of those who do, grow envious and also want assistance. Since the dominant elites cannot aid everyone, they end by increasing the restiveness of the oppressed. The revolutionary leaders should take advantage of the contradictions of manipulation by posing it as a problem to the oppressed, with the objective of organizing them. Cultural invasion. The theory of anti-dialogical action has one last fundamental characteristic: cultural invasion, which, like divisive tactics and manipulation, also serves the ends of conquest. In this phenomenon, the invaders penetrate the cultural context of another group in disrespect of the latter's potentialities. They impose their own view of the world upon those they invade and inhibit the creativity of the invaded by curbing their expression. Whether urbane or harsh, cultural invasion is thus always an act of violence against the persons of the invaded culture, who lose their originality or face the threat of losing it. In cultural invasion, as in all the modalities of anti-dialogical action, the invaders are the authors of and actors in the process. Those they invade are the objects. The invaders mold, those they invade are molded. The invaders choose, those they invade follow that choice, or are expected to follow it. The invaders act, those they invade have only the illusion of acting through the action of the invaders. All domination involves invasion, at times physical and overt, at times camouflaged, with the invader assuming the role of a helping friend. In the last analysis, invasion is a form of economic and cultural domination. Invasion may be practiced by a metropolitan society upon a dependent society, or it may be implicit in the domination of one class over another within the same society. Cultural conquest leads to the cultural inauthenticity of those who are invaded. They begin to respond to the values, the standards, and the goals of the invaders. In their passion to dominate, to mold others to their patterns and their way of life, the invaders desire to know how those they have invaded apprehend reality, but only so they can dominate the latter more effectively. Note 29. To this end, the invaders are making increasing use of the social sciences and technology, and to some extent the physical sciences as well, to improve and refine their action. It is indispensable for the invaders to know the past and present of those invaded in order to discern the alternatives of the latter's future, and thereby attempt to guide the evolution of that future along lines that will favor their own interests. In cultural invasion, it is essential that those who are invaded come to see their reality with the outlook of the invaders rather than their own, for the more they mimic the invaders, the more stable the position of the latter becomes. Ooh. Like YouTubers who have to do sponsorships and take AdSense and ultimately mimic the goals of the YouTube algorithm and its overlords so that they can stabilize their position. Spooky. Things to think about, right? For cultural invasion to succeed, it is essential that those invaded become convinced of their intrinsic inferiority. Since everything has its opposite, if those who are invaded consider themselves inferior, they must necessarily recognize the superiority of the invaders. The values of the latter thereby become the pattern for the former. The more invasion is accentuated and those invaded are alienated from the spirit of their own culture and from themselves, the more the latter want to be like the invaders, to walk like them, dress like them, talk like them. The social I of the invaded person, like every social I, is formed in the socio-cultural relations of the social structure, and therefore reflects the duality of the invaded culture. This duality, which was described earlier, explains why invaded and dominated individuals, at a certain moment of their existential experience, almost adhere to the oppressor thou. The oppressed I must break with this near adhesion to the oppressor thou, drawing away from the latter in order to see him more objectively, at which point she critically recognizes herself to be in contradiction with the oppressor. In so doing, he considers as a dehumanizing reality the structure in which he is being oppressed. This qualitative change in the perception of the world can only be achieved in the praxis. Cultural invasion is on the one hand an instrument of domination, and on the other the result of domination. Thus, cultural action of a dominating character, like other forms of anti-dialogical action, in addition to being deliberate and planned, is in another sense simply a product of oppressive reality. For example, a rigid and oppressive social structure necessarily influences the institutions of child rearing and education within that structure. These institutions pattern their action after the style of the structure and transmit the myths of the latter. Homes and schools, from nurseries to universities, exist not in the abstract, but in time and space. Within the structures of domination, they function largely as agencies which prepare the invaders of the future. The parent-child relationship in the home usually reflects the objective cultural conditions of the surrounding social structure. If the conditions which penetrate the home are authoritarian, rigid, and dominating, the home will increase the climate of oppression. Note 30. Young people increasingly view parent and teacher authoritarianism as inimical to their own freedom. For this very reason, they increasingly oppose forms of action which minimize their expressiveness and hinder their self-affirmation. this very positive phenomenon is not accidental. It is actually a symptom of the historical climate which, as mentioned in Chapter 1, characterizes our epoch as an anthropological one. For this reason, one cannot, unless he has a personal interest in doing so, see the youth rebellion as a mere example of the traditional differences between generations. Something deeper is involved here. This is deep. Young people in their rebellion are denouncing and condemning the unjust model of a society of domination. This rebellion, with its special dimension, however, is very recent. Society continues to be authoritarian in character. As these authoritarian... Yes, you're correct in that intercept. As these authoritarian relations between parents and children intensify, children in their infancy increasingly internalize the paternal authority. Presenting with his customary clarity the problem of necrophilia and biophilia, Fromm analyzes the objective conditions which generate each condition, whether in the home, parent-child relations in a climate of indifference and oppression or of love and freedom, or in a socio-cultural context. If children reared in an atmosphere of lovelessness and oppression, children whose potency has been frustrated, do not manage during their youth to take the path of authentic rebellion, they will either drift into total indifference, alienated from reality by the authorities and the myths the latter have used to shape them, or they may engage in forms of destructive action. The atmosphere of the home is prolonged in the school, where the students soon discover that, as in the home, in order to achieve some satisfaction, they must adapt to the precepts which have been set from above. One of these precepts is not to think. And we've talked about that on this channel. On the Elliot Sang channel, to be clear. Internalizing paternal authority through the rigid relationship structure emphasized by the school, these young people tend, when they become professionals, because of the very fear of freedom instilled by these relationships, to repeat the rigid patterns in which they were miseducated. This phenomenon, in addition to their class position, perhaps explains why so many professionals adhere to anti-dialogical action. Whatever the specialty that brings them into contact with the people, they are almost unshakably convinced that it is their mission to give the latter their knowledge and techniques. Note 31. It perhaps also explains the anti-dialogical behavior of persons who, although convinced of their revolutionary commitment, continue to mistrust the people and fear communion with them. Unconsciously, such persons retain the oppressor within themselves, and because they house the master, they fear freedom. They see themselves as promoters of the people. Their programs of action, which might have been prescribed by any good theorist of oppressive action, include their own objectives, their own convictions, and their own preoccupations. They do not listen to the people, but instead plan to teach them how to cast off the laziness which creates underdevelopment. To these professionals, it seems absurd to consider the necessity of respecting the view of the world held by the people. The professionals are the ones with a world view. They regard as equally absurd the affirmation that one must necessarily consult the people when organizing the program content of educational action. They feel that the ignorance of the people is so complete that they are unfit for anything except to receive the teachings of the professionals. When, however, at a certain point of their existential experience, those who have been invaded begin in one way or another to reject this invasion, to which they might earlier have adapted. The professionals, in order to justify their failure, say that the members of the invaded group are inferior because they are ingrates, shiftless, diseased, or of mixed blood. Well-intentioned professionals, those who use invasion not as deliberate ideology but as the expression of their own upbringing, eventually discover that certain of their educational features must be ascribed, not to the intrinsic inferiority of the simple men of the people, but to the violence of their own act of invasion. Those who make this discovery face a difficult alternative. They feel the need to renounce invasion, but patterns of domination are so entrenched within them that this renunciation would become a threat to their own identities. To renounce invasion would mean ending their dual status as dominated and dominators. It would mean abandoning all the myths which nourish invasion and starting to incarnate dialogical action. For this very reason, it would mean to cease being over or inside as foreigners in order to be with as comrades. And so the fear of freedom takes hold of these men. During this traumatic process, they naturally tend to rationalize their fear with a series of evasions, not invasions, a series of evasions. Who else engages in series of evasions to avoid traumatic processes of having to, kill certain parts of oneself? The fear of freedom is greater still in professionals who have not yet discovered for themselves the invasive nature of their action, and who are told that their action is dehumanizing. Not infrequently, especially at the point of decoding concrete situations, training course participants ask the coordinator in an irritated manner, "Where do you think you're steering us anyway?" The coordinator isn't trying to steer them anywhere. It is just that in facing a concrete situation as a problem, the participants begin to realize that if their analysis of the situation goes any deeper, they will either have to divest themselves of their myths or reaffirm them. Divesting themselves of and renouncing their myths represents at that moment an act of self-violence. On the other hand, to reaffirm those myths is to reveal themselves. The only way out, which functions as a defense mechanism, is to project onto the coordinator their own usual practices: steering, conquering, and invading. That's kind of how like the abusive person, when you try to confront them on their abuse, turn it on you. You're abusive, right? See my extension au communicant. That's note 32. This same retreat occurs, though on a smaller scale, among men of the people who have been ground down by the concrete situation of oppression and domesticated by charity. One of the teachers of Full Circle, which carried out a valuable educational program in New York City under the coordination of Robert Fox, relates the following incident. Note 33, regarding the activities of this institution, see Mary Cole, Summer in the City, New York, 1968. A group in a New York ghetto was presented a coded situation showing a big pile of garbage on a street corner, the very same street where the group was meeting. One of the participants said at once, "I see a street in Africa or Latin America." "And why not in New York?" asked the teacher. "Because we are the United States, and that can't happen here." Beyond a doubt, this man and some of his comrades who agreed with him were retreating from a reality so offensive to them that even to acknowledge that reality was threatening. For an alienated person, conditioned by a culture of achievement and personal success, to recognize his situation as generally objectively unfavorable seems to hinder his own possibilities of success. In the case cited, and in that of the professionals, the determining force of the culture which develops the myths men subsequently internalize is evident. In both cases, the culture of the dominant class hinders the affirmation of men as beings of decision. Neither the professionals nor the discussion participants in the New York slums talk and act for themselves as active subjects of the historical process. None of them are theoreticians or ideologues of domination. On the contrary, they are effects which in turn become causes of domination. This is one of the most serious problems the revolution must confront when it reaches power. This stage demands maximum political wisdom, decision, and courage from the leaders who, for this very reason, must have sufficient judgment not to fall into irrationally sectarian positions. Professional women and men of any specialty, university graduates or not, are individuals who have been determined from above by a culture of domination which has constituted them as dual beings. Note 34, see Louis Althusser, pour Marx, in which he dedicates an entire chapter to la dialectique de la surdétermination. See you, MJ. Sleep well. If they had come from the lower classes, this miseducation would be the same, if not worse. These professionals, however, are necessary to the reorganization of the new society. And since many among them, even though afraid of freedom and reluctant to engage in humanizing action, are in truth more misguided than anything else, they not only could be, but ought to be, reclaimed by the revolution. This reclamation requires that the revolutionary leaders, progressing from what was previously dialogical cultural action, initiate the cultural revolution. At this point, revolutionary power moves beyond its role as a necessary obstacle, confronting those who wish to negate humanity, and assumes a new and bolder position with a clear invitation to all who wish to participate in the reconstruction of society. In this sense, cultural revolution is a necessary continuation of the dialogical cultural action, which must be carried out before the revolution takes power, or reaches power, I mean to say. Cultural revolution takes the total society to be reconstructed, including all human activities, as the object of its remolding action. Society cannot be reconstructed in a mechanistic fashion. The culture, which is culturally recreated through revolution, is the fundamental instrument for this reconstruction. Cultural revolution is the revolutionary regime's maximum effort at conscientisation. It should reach everyone, regardless of their personal path. Consequently, this effort at conscientisation cannot rest content with the technical or scientific training of intended specialists. The new society becomes qualitatively distinct from the old in more than a partial way. Note 35. This process, however, does not occur suddenly, as mechanistic thinkers naively assume. He loves to remind us of that. It's not mechanistic. Revolutionary society cannot attribute to technology the same ends attributed by the previous society. Accordingly, the training of people in the two societies must also differ. Technical and scientific training need not be inimical to humanistic education as long as science and technology in the revolutionary society are at the service of permanent liberation of humanization. What's up, AA? Don't worry about it. The stream will be uploaded to my channel, Reading with Elliot, which is over here. From this point of view, the training of individuals for any occupation, since all occupations occur in time and space, requires the understanding of A, culture as a superstructure which can maintain remnants of the past alive in the substructure undergoing revolutionary transformation, and B, the occupation itself as an instrument for the transformation of culture. As the cultural revolution deepens conscientisation and the creative praxis of the new society, people will begin to perceive why mythical remnants of the old society survive in the new. And they will then be able to free themselves more rapidly of these specters, which, by hindering the edification of a new society, have always constituted a serious problem for every revolution. Through these cultural remnants, the oppressor society continues to invade, this time invading the revolutionary society itself. This invasion is especially terrible because it is carried out not only by the dominant elite reorganized as such, but by those who have participated in the revolution. As men who house the oppressor, they resist, as might the latter themselves, the further basic steps which the revolution must take. And as dual beings, they also accept, still due to the remnants, power which becomes bureaucratized and which violently represses them. In turn, this violently repressive bureaucratic power can be explained by what Althusser calls the reactivation of old elements in the new society each time special circumstances permit. Note 37 on this matter. This is a French quote. I'm not going to bother trying to read it. I don't know if our French speakers are here today, though. For all the above reasons, I interpret the revolutionary process as dialogical cultural action, which is prolonged in cultural revolution once power is taken. In both stages, a serious and profound effort at conscientisation, by means of which the people, through a true praxis, leave behind the status of objects to assume the status of historical subjects, is necessary. Finally, cultural revolution develops the practice of permanent dialogue between leaders and people, and consolidates the participation of the people in power. In this way, as both leaders and people continue their critical activity, the revolution will more easily be able to defend itself against bureaucratic tendencies, which lead to new forms of oppression, and against invasion, which is always the same. The invader, whether in a bourgeois or in a revolutionary society, may be an agronomist or a sociologist, an economist or a public health engineer, a priest or a pastor, an educator or a social worker, or a revolutionary. Excuse me. Cultural invasion, which serves the ends of conquest and the preservation of oppression, always involves a parochial view of reality, a static perception of the world, and the imposition of one worldview upon another. It implies the superiority of the invader and the inferiority of those who are invaded, as well as the imposition of values by the former, who possess the latter and are afraid of losing them. Cultural invasion further signifies that the ultimate seat of decision regarding the action of those who are invaded lies not with them, but with the invaders. And when the power of decision is located outside rather than within the one who should decide, the latter has only the illusion of deciding. This is like the key theme. This is him reiterating a key theme, and I think it's a really great quote to encapsulate that. When the power of decision is located outside rather than within the one who should decide, the latter has only the illusion of deciding. Right? And so that goes back to the importance of the dialogical nature of liberation, right? The whole point is that you can't make people do stuff. It's like, the concept of holding people accountable, for instance, is a good example of this. We say we got to hold people accountable. But in reality, the only person who can hold you accountable is you. And we can aid in maybe helping you see how you should hold yourself accountable and helping facilitate that. But at the end of the day, human beings cannot make other human beings repent. They cannot make other human beings change. They cannot make other human beings grasp things or learn things. You have to learn yourself, right? And part of learning yourself is also recognizing that you have something to teach, but that if you're not willing to engage in learning and teaching with other people, including having processes of accountability with yourself to a community, then the thing that you have to give has nowhere to go, because it's ultimately not going to go anywhere other than in practices of the dominator, the oppressor that you've internalized, right? Cultural invasion further signifies that the ultimate seat of decision regarding the action of those who are invaded lies not with them, but with the invaders. And when the power of decision is located outside rather than within the one who should decide, the latter has only the illusion of deciding. This is why there can be no socioeconomic development in a dual reflex invaded society. For development to occur, it is necessary, A, that there be a movement of search and creativity having its seat of decision in the searcher, B, that this movement occur not only in space but in the existential time of the conscious searcher. Thus, while all development is transformation, not all transformation is development. The transformation occurring in a seed which under favorable conditions germinates and sprouts is not development. In the same way, the transformation of an animal is not development. Again, we're having that conversation. The note says this reactivation would be properly inconceivable in a dialectic lacking overdetermination. Don't know if it makes sense in English. Worth revisiting. Yeah, worth revisiting. In the same way, the transformation of an animal is not development. The transformation of seeds and animals are determined by the species to which they belong, and they occur in a time which does not belong to them, for time belongs to humankind. Women and men, among the uncompleted beings, are the only ones which develop. As historical, autobiographical beings for themselves, their transformation, development, occurs in their own existential time, never outside it. Men who are submitted to concrete conditions of oppression in which they become alienated beings for another, of the false being for himself on whom they depend, are not able to develop authentically. Deprived of their own power of decision, which is located in the oppressor, they follow the prescriptions of the latter. The oppressed only begin to develop when, surmounting the contradiction in which they are caught, they become beings for themselves. If we consider society as a being, it is obvious that only a society which is a being for itself can develop. Societies which are dual, reflex, invaded, and dependent on the metropolitan society cannot develop because they are alienated. Their political, economic, and cultural decision-making power is located outside themselves, in the invader society. In the last analysis, the latter determines the destiny of the former, mere transformation, for it is their transformation, not their development, that is to the interest of the metropolitan society. It is essential not to confuse modernization with development. The former, although it may affect certain groups in the satellite society, is almost always induced, and it is the metropolitan society which derives the true benefits therefrom. A society which is merely modernized without developing will continue, even if it takes over some minimal delegated powers of decision, to depend on the outside country. This is the fate of any dependent society, as long as it remains dependent. Neocolonialism is a good term to think about in this conversation. In order to conversation, I don't like how I said that. Conversation. In order to determine whether or not a society is developing, one must go beyond criteria based on indices of per capita income, which expressed in statistical form are misleading, as well as those which concentrate on the study of gross income. The basic elementary criterion is whether or not the society is a being for itself. If it is not, the other criteria indicate modernization rather than development. The principal contradiction of dual societies is the relationship of dependency between them and the metropolitan society. Once the contradiction has been superseded, the transformation hitherto effected through aid, which has primarily benefited the metropolitan society, becomes true development, which benefits the being for itself. For the above reasons, the purely reformist solutions attempted by these societies, even though some of the reforms may frighten and even panic the more reactionary members of the elite groups, do not resolve their external and internal contradictions. This is the sort of reformism versus revolution debate. Almost always, the metropolitan society induces these reformist solutions in response to the demands of the historical process, as a new way of preserving its hegemony. It is as if the metropolitan society were saying, let us carry out reforms before the people carry out a revolution. And in order to achieve this goal, the metropolitan society has no options other than conquest, manipulation, economic and cultural, and sometimes military invasion of the dependent society. An invasion in which the elite leaders of the dominated society, to a large extent, act as mere brokers for the leaders of the metropolitan society. To close this tentative analysis of the theory of anti-dialogical action, I wish to reaffirm that revolutionary leaders must not use the same anti-dialogical procedures used by the oppressors. On the contrary, revolutionary leaders must follow the path of dialogue and of communication. Before proceeding to analyze the theory of dialogical action, it is essential to discuss briefly how the revolutionary leadership group is formed and some of the historical and sociological consequences for the revolutionary process. Usually, this leadership group is made up of men and women who, in one way or another, have belonged to the social strata of the dominators. At a certain point in their existential experience, under certain historical conditions, these leaders renounce the class to which they belong and join the oppressed in an act of true solidarity, or so one would hope. Whether or not this adherence results from a scientific analysis of reality, it represents, when authentic, an act of love and true commitment. Note 38. The thoughts of Guevara on this subject are cited in the preceding chapter. Germán Guzmán says of Camilo Torres, he gave everything. At all times, he maintained a vital posture of commitment to the people, as a priest, as a Christian, and as a revolutionary. Joining the oppressed requires going to them and communicating with them. The people must find themselves in the emerging leaders, and the latter must find themselves in the people. The leaders who have emerged necessarily reflect the contradiction of the dominant elites communicated to them by the oppressed, who may not yet, however, clearly perceive their own state of oppression or critically recognize their relationship of antagonism to the oppressors. Note 39. Class necessity is one thing, class consciousness is another. They may be still in the position previously termed adhesion to the oppressor. On the other hand, it is possible that due to certain objective historical conditions, they have already reached a relatively clear perception of their state of oppression. In the first case, the adhesion, or partial adhesion, of the people to the oppressor makes it impossible for them, to repeat Fanon's point, to locate him outside themselves. In the second case, they can locate the oppressor and can thus critically recognize their relationship of antagonism to him. In the first case, the oppressor is housed within the people, and their resulting ambiguity makes them fearful of freedom. They resort, stimulated by the oppressor, to magical explanations or a false view of God, to whom they fatalistically transfer the responsibility for their oppressed state. This is a fascinating sort of distinguishment when it comes to talking about religion. Also, note 40. A Chilean priest of high intellectual and moral caliber visiting Recife in 1966 told me, when a Pernambucan colleague and I went to see several families living in shanties, mocambos, in indescribable poverty, I asked them how they could bear to live like that, and the answer was always the same. What can I do? It is the will of God, and I must accept it. It is extremely unlikely that these self-mistrustful, downtrodden, hopeless people will seek their own liberation, an act of rebellion which they may view as a disobedient violation of the will of God, as an unwarranted confrontation with destiny. Hence the oft-emphasized necessity of posing as problems the myths fed to the people by the oppressors. In the second case, when the people have reached a relatively clear picture of oppression which leads them to localize the oppressor outside themselves, they take up the struggle to surmount the contradiction in which they are caught. At this moment, they overcome the distance between class necessity and class consciousness. In the first case, the revolutionary leaders unfortunately and involuntarily become the contradiction of the people. In the second case, the emerging leaders receive from the people sympathetic and almost instantaneous support, which tends to increase during the process of revolutionary action. The leaders go to the people in a spontaneously dialogical manner. There is an almost immediate empathy between the people and the revolutionary leaders. Their mutual commitment is almost instantly sealed. In fellowship, they consider themselves co-equal contradictions of the dominant elites. From this point on, the established practice of dialogue between people and leaders is nearly unshakable. That dialogue will continue and power is reached, and the people will know that they have come to power. This sharing in no way diminishes the spirit of struggle, courage, capacity for love, or daring required of the revolutionary leaders. Fidel Castro and his comrades, whom many at the time termed irresponsible adventurers, an eminently dialogical leadership group, identified with the people who endured the brutal violence of the Batista dictatorship. This adherence was not easy. It required bravery on the part of the leaders to love the people sufficiently to be willing to sacrifice themselves for them. It required courageous witness by the leaders to recommence after each disaster, moved by undying hope in a future victory which, because forged together with the people, would belong not to the leaders alone, but to the leaders and the people, or to the people including the leaders. Fidel gradually polarized the adherents of the Cuban people, who, due to their historical experience, had already begun to break their adhesion to the oppressor. This drawing away from the oppressor led the people to objectify him and to see themselves as his contradiction. So it was that Fidel never entered into contradiction with the people. The occasional desertions or betrayals registered by Guevara in his Relato de la Guerra Revolucionaria, in which he also refers to the many who adhered, were to be expected. Thus, due to certain historical conditions, the movement by the revolutionary leaders to the people is either horizontal, so that leaders and people form one body in contradiction to the oppressor, or it is triangular, with the revolutionary leaders occupying the vertex of the triangle in contradiction to the oppressors and to the oppressed as well. As we have seen, the latter situation is forced on the leaders when the people have not yet achieved a critical perception of oppressive reality. Almost never, however, does a revolutionary leadership group perceive that it constitutes a contradiction to the people. Indeed, this perception is painful, and the resistance may serve as a defense mechanism. After all, it is not easy for leaders who have emerged through adherence to the oppressed to recognize themselves as being in contradiction with those to whom they adhered. It is important to recognize this reluctance when analyzing certain forms of behavior on the part of revolutionary leaders who involuntarily become a contradiction, though not antagonists of the people. I just noticed, I haven't responded to Intercept's comment. I agree with this. I think another interesting detail is how we are all interdependent on each other. For instance, even the oppressor is dependent on the oppressed for actual labor, etc. Right, like all of existence and environments and ecosystems are kind of interdependent in very important ways that we haven't tapped into yet because we're still stuck in these forms of domination as the things that govern us, right? In order to carry out the revolution, revolutionary leaders undoubtedly require the adherence of the people. When leaders who constitute a contradiction to the people seek this adherence and find rather a certain aloofness and mistrust, they often regard this reaction as indicating an inherent defect on the part of the people. They interpret a certain historical moment of the people's unconsciousness as evidence of their intrinsic deficiency. Since the leaders need the adherence of the people so that the revolution can be achieved, but at the same time mistrust the mistrustful people, they are tempted to utilize the same procedures used by the dominant elites to oppress. Rationalizing their lack of confidence in the people, The leaders say that it is impossible to dialogue with the people before taking power, thus opting for the anti-dialogical theory of action. Thenceforward, just like the dominant elites, they try to conquer the people. They become messianic. They use manipulation and carry out cultural invasion. By advancing along these paths, the paths of oppression, they will not achieve revolution. Or if they do, it will not be authentic revolution. The role of revolutionary leadership under any circumstances, but especially so in those described, is to consider seriously, even as they act. Did I miss a note? No, I don't think so. Yeah, no. Even as they act, the reasons for any attitude of mistrust on the part of the people, and to seek out true avenues of communion with them, ways of helping the people to help themselves critically perceive the reality which oppresses them. The dominated consciousness is dual, ambiguous, full of fear and mistrust. 41. On this point, see Erich Fromm, The Application of Humanist Psychoanalysis to Marxist Theory in Socialist Humanism, and Ruben Osborne, Marxism and Psychoanalysis. I might want to check these out. In his diary about the struggle in Bolivia, Guevara refers several times to the lack of peasant participation. The peasant mobilization does not exist except for informative duties which annoy us somewhat. They are neither very rapid nor very efficient. They can be neutralized. Complete lack of incorporation of the peasants, although they are losing their fear of us and we are succeeding in winning their admiration. It is a slow and patient task. Note 42, Che Guevara, The Secret Papers of a Revolutionary, The Diary of Che Guevara. The internalization of the oppressor by the dominated consciousness of the peasants explains their fear and their inefficiency. The behavior and reactions of the oppressed, which lead the oppressor to practice cultural invasion, should evoke from the revolutionary a different theory of action. What distinguishes revolutionary leaders from the dominant elite is not only their objectives, but their procedures. If they act in the same way, the objectives become identical. It is as self-contradictory for the dominant elites to pose human world relations as problems to the people as it is for the revolutionary leaders not to do so. Let us now analyze the theory of dialogical cultural action and attempt to apprehend its constituent elements. And folks, this is where I'm actually going to stop for the day. We are 16 pages away from finishing, and it is time for me to go get dinner. This has been a whopping near 3-hour stream, and we are almost done with Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are almost done with Chapter 4. I hope you have been enjoying it so far. This chapter is very thick. It's very, at times, feels a bit repetitive in certain senses. Freire's writing can be kind of like that, but it's because he's trying to drill certain concepts into your head. And I think that that's one of the most important ways that you can read this book and move forward, is to say, let me drill one of the concepts in my head that I just read. Let me put it in there and see how I can apply it, right? So let's reconvene tomorrow, same time basically, maybe 3 p.m. Eastern, so like an hour earlier, and we'll finish up and we'll talk about the book as a whole afterwards. Take care. Have a great day. See you.